I'm going to go over some of the basic shape tools that we use. So the tools that I use most frequently are the pen tool and the pencil tool for drawing. So the pen tool, shortcut P, also found here. This tool uses vectors to help you draw straight lines and lines that look more accurate, or if you had to draw something that's more technical, you might want to use this tool. It emulates the curves that you might get from a French curve. If you press Shift, you can also draw very straight and perfect lines, like so. There's also the pencil tool. I like to use this tool with my tablet because that allows me to draw more organic shapes. The shortcut is N, but you can also find it over here in the Tools panel. So I can draw anything like this, something squiggly and organic. And if I hold down Option, this gives me the smoothing tool. That just smooths out some of the rougher lines of the pencil tool. So once again, you have the pencil tool, which is kind of rough, and you can smooth it out into something softer, more natural and pretty looking. That is one of my favorite tools to use. You can also use just the basic shape tools found here. You have rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, star, and flare. So once again, if you want to make very perfect shapes, you've got these tools to work with. So going forward with that knowledge, why don't we look at how we would have built this character using those tools? So since this is a perfect circle, we can go to our Shapes panel and click the Ellipse tool. If you hold down Option and Shift, it will draw the circle from the center of the circle and give you a perfect circle instead of just any old ellipse. Without the shift, you can get a wobbly ellipse, and with the shift, you get a perfect circle. That is what you would do to get the head of your character, and you can do the same thing to get the eyeballs. For the body, I'm going to show you a fun tool. You can use a rectangle, pretty much like what we have here. But to get the shoulders, which are rounded, Adobe Illustrator Creative Cloud has this new feature which allows you to create rounded corners. So if you select the corner, this point over here, this circle will appear, and if you tug on that, it puts a radius on the corner, and you can adjust how rounded you want that corner to be. So I've selected both shoulders because I want them to be rounded to the same degree, and just pulling on that dot, I'm adjusting how round I want that corner to be. So that's how you would get the body. Now the legs and arms for our crash course style are very simple. They are basically just a stroke. So to do that, you can use your line tool, which is found over here. It's also backslash shortcut. So I'm just going to pull that out and hold Shift to get a 45-degree angle. So as you can see, I have a line, but it doesn't look like the arm that we already have. And the reason for that is because we don't have a stroke or fill on this line. So I'm going to apply a stroke to the line. There, I've applied a stroke to it just by selecting a color in my Colors panel. I can adjust the width of the line over here in my Stroke panel. Because we don't want little twiggy arms, we want thicker arms, I'm going to play with the numbers to see what works. You can also drag down the numbers like so, but generally I like to type the numbers in manually. So that looks pretty close. As we can see from these reference images, Gilgamesh is a pretty big guy. If you've read any of the myths, he's described as fairly strong and muscular. So we're going to upgrade this character to give him some muscles and some definition. There are several ways we could do that. I could draw it using the pencil tool. So using my tablet and the pencil tool, shortcut N. I could draw a little bubble muscle here because the last thing I used was the cyan color stroke. That's what it's applying to my current object. But if I want it to be more skin tone color, I can use my eyedropper tool, shortcut I, and eyedropper the skin that I already have and apply that to the muscle. Or I could make the muscle red like the pants. I could also go into the color panels and manually select the skin tone. So I have the shoulder muscle there, and I think I'll give him some inner arm muscles, something like this. We don't want it to be too much because Crash Course is still fairly flat and simple, so I'm going to keep it minimal still. But you get the point. You can draw something like this, make sure things are connected. Once you have a shape, like so, it can have a stroke and a fill. A stroke is just the outline, and the fill is the color that's on the inside of the object. So for example, I can have this green inside, and the stroke can be a different color, like this blue. You can adjust the width of the stroke, like 10 points, which is thicker, or 2.25 points, which is so thin you can barely see it. And that can be applied to a shape or just a line. Here you can see that the line has a stroke and a fill, but the fill will not appear because the line is not a complete shape. So we're going to talk a bit about grouping objects. Different people work different ways, but I like to group objects that go together just so that when I select one thing, the entire group will move together. So let's say I wanted this line and shape to move together. I would group them by selecting both of them and clicking Command G. That's the shortcut to group these objects. And now if I have my selection tool, shortcut V, if I select any one of these objects, both of them will get selected. So that's what grouping does, and it's very convenient. For example, if I just click on this part of the arm and move it, the entire arm doesn't move because it's not grouped. But if I want them to move together as one arm, I can select all these parts of the arm and select Command G. And now when I select any part of the arm, the whole arm will move together. So you can do the same thing for the legs. I like to work this way just so that it's easier and I don't have pieces flying in different directions. So now that we've got some of the basics of drawing shapes down, we can talk about transformations. So there are different tools that allow you to transform shapes that you've already created. So those are over here on the side. There's the rotate and reflect, as well as the scale and shear tools. So the ones that I use most often are rotate, reflect, and scale. Reflect does exactly what it sounds like. It reflects objects. So for example, I have this character's right arm, and I need to make the character's left arm. So what I'm going to do is double click on this, and if I select the vertical option, it will reflect on the vertical axis, versus selecting the horizontal option, it will reflect on the horizontal axis. If I just click OK, it will take the arm that I have and reflect it on the vertical axis. But I need both arms, so I'm going to click Copy, and this will create a copy of the original arm that I've selected. Now I can take that duplicate arm and drag it over here somewhere. Another tip for using the reflection tool is, you saw how I had to move the arm from over here to over here? That takes an extra step. If you don't want to do that, and you know exactly where the vertical axis that you want to reflect on is, you can go to your reflection tool, shortcut O, and place your mouse where that vertical axis is, press Option and click down. that will reflect directly on the axis that you've selected, so that arm ends up perfectly symmetrically on the other side of the character's body. So once again, we click copy to make a copy, and now you have the arm exactly where you want it. There's also the scale tool. Similar to the reflection object, it does exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to scale an object. Let's say I wanted this head to be bigger. I can select it, and then pressing S for my scale tool, or selecting it in my tools panel, I can scale it any way I want. However, if I wanted to scale at a perfect ratio, I hold Shift and it will scale at a perfect ratio, maintaining the circle as a perfect circle. So that head would be too big. So that tool will probably come in handy later. I usually use it when I'm drawing landscapes and drawing things in perspective, and I realize, oh, that building looks way too small compared to that person. The last tool we're going to talk about is rotation. The shortcut is R, and this tool allows you to rotate an object. You can change the rotation point, which is this dot over here. You can set it to anywhere you want, as long as you're on your rotation tool, shortcut R. If you click somewhere, that becomes the new rotation point that the object will rotate around. I'm going to talk about the alignment tool now. This tool comes in handy a lot when I want to make something symmetrical, or when I need to line something up perfectly. Let's say I have these two arms and they were over here and I needed to line them up with the body perfectly. I could group the two arms to be one object, and I can align the arms as one object with the head as the center of the body. So I'm going to select the head, click the head again to make it the key object, and then over in my Align panel, which you can get to by clicking Window Align, I'm going to click the Horizontal Align Center. That will align things to the horizontal center axis. I could also click Align Left, but that wouldn't make sense for the arms, because the arms need to be symmetrically centered to the body. So just to show sort of how that works, let's take three objects, like these three rectangles. I've made the center object the key object and made all these, I want these other boxes to align to the center object. Select the middle object as the key object and then select Center Align. Or maybe I want to make all the objects right aligned to this object. So I would select the bottom object as the key object, and then I would select Horizontal Align Right. I could do the same thing to make it Horizontal Align Left. You can do the same thing to align things up, or you can align things to the top of the middle object. There's also the distribution tools. So let's say I have all the objects aligned horizontally, like so, but I want them evenly dispersed. So this has a big space here, but a little gap here, and I want them to have even gaps. So I can select all the objects and then distribute them vertically, and that will give me equal spacing between all the objects. We're also going to talk about the Pathfinder tool, which I use a lot and is very similar to the Shapemaker tool. So Pathfinder is kind of like a Boolean. It allows you to add and subtract different objects from each other. So for example, if I have two squares, it's exactly like what it looks like in this panel. So if I want to add the squares up, I'll click this one and it will combine these two objects. If I want to subtract it, the one on top will erase from the bottom. Erase. This tool will give you the places where the two objects overlap. So the small square is where the two objects overlap. And this last one will give you the parts of the objects that don't overlap. So these two sort of arrow-looking objects are what you are left with. The Pathfinder tool that I use the most often is Divide. That takes these two shapes and, like a cookie cutter, will cut them out from each other. So now all the edges have been separated. This tool is very similar to the Shapemaker tool, which I believe is Shift-M. This tool is like a shortcut of the Pathfinder tools Add and Divide. If you're on the tool, it will automatically want to add objects. So if I drag it across these two shapes, it will add them together. If I drag it across these two, it will add them together. If you are on the Shapemaker tool and you hold Option, it becomes the Subtract tool. Now anything that I drag over, it will erase. So if I want to subtract those two shapes, there they go. This can be a really good tool if you want to draw organic objects and want to cut pieces away. For example, let's say I have this rectangle and I want to make grass. I'm going to draw some grass really quickly, make it organic using the pencil tool. I can select both and going to my Shapemaker tool, holding down Option, now I can delete that top part of the grass and delete these extra line segments that I don't need, and now I have grass. Make sure you delete the extra line segment that you're also left with. That's a really quick way to use that tool. I mentioned that it's similar to the Pathfinder tool because if I did the same thing with the Pathfinder tool, I would select these two objects, click Divide, and now I can erase the top object and I'm left with, again, the bottom one for grass. So they work very similarly. I think it's just preference of what people like to use. So those are the basic tools we use to create our characters. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to use colors in Illustrator. So we talked about it briefly, about how to use the color panel over here, and how you can select fill and stroke colors for your objects. Now we're going to go into some more advanced techniques for how we select and manipulate colors in Illustrator. So the first thing I want to talk about is gradients. So Crash Course employs a very simple style. We don't use gradients a lot, but we do if we want to create a pop or a shine or a shadow. So how gradients work is you open up your gradients panel and you have the object that you want to apply the gradient tool selected. In the gradient panel, if I click this, the default gradient will always be white to black. There are two types of gradients, linear, which goes in a straight line, and radial, which goes in a circle or ellipse from the center. You can adjust the shape of that gradient by dragging these 2 points at the edges of the ellipse. The shortcut to get to this gradient tool is G, or you can find it in your side panel here where it says gradient tool. So we don't want a white to black gradient because even though these statues I'm using for reference are monochromatic, we know that Gilgamesh, as he was imagined, probably wore very colorful clothing very majestic looking clothing. So I would like to pick some richer colors for Gilgamesh to wear, and I'm going to show you how to do that using the Gradients panel. So I'm in my Gradient panel, and I want to click this square, which will allow us to select the color that we want to start our gradient with. So right now it's in our black and white default, but we don't want those colors, we want rich colors. So holding Shift, I'm going to click this gradient rectangle down here, and that brings up other color selection panels. So here we have RGB. If I click again, I get HSB. Click it again, I get CMYK. Again, I get another RGB. Again, I go back to black and white. But since we're working for social media, I want this to be in RGB, which is the additive color system. So now that I have a color panel, I can either click and drag through this bottom bar to select a color, or I can play with the sliders above the bar. Let's say I want a more yellowy color, not so pink. I can drag this slider up and get some more yellow into that color. And you can do the same thing with the second square, and that will adjust the end color of your gradient. So I like the color that Gilgamesh is currently wearing, so I'm going to go into the colors panel and select the hexadecimal code of that color and paste it into the gradient panel here. So let's say we want to apply the gradient from this rectangle onto Gilgamesh's clothing. I can either select Gilgamesh's clothing and go into the gradients panel where it will have saved the most recent gradient that I used, or I can use the eyedropper tool, shortcut I, and eyedropper on the rectangle to apply that gradient to the shape that I've selected. So now that we have the gradient applied to Gilgamesh's clothing, I can proceed to use my gradient tool, shortcut G, and either choose a radial gradient or a linear gradient. And I'm thinking maybe a linear gradient would work better here. Actually, what I'm seeing right now is that this gradient might be too strong and is breaking the crash course style a little bit. So maybe I want to apply the gradient more as a shadow here under his skirt tunic thing. So since I want a shadow, I'm going to darken the original color a little bit and select linear gradient. Since the shadow is coming from under the original shirt, that's where the darkest part will be, and it will get lighter as it goes down. So once again, using the gradient tool G and selecting where the gradient comes from, I can choose where to make the darkest part come from. So now that I'm looking at my Gilgamesh, I'm thinking that the purple doesn't look like a very warrior-esque color. Maybe I want to change that. I do like that it's very royal, so maybe I won't go too far from the purple. So what I'm going to do is select all the areas that are purple. And then I'm going to go up here to this Recolor Artwork tool. It looks like a circle. I like to use this tool when I want to change multiple pieces of art at once. Here we have all our purples all together. And I'm going to go into here, which gives me all the options for different color palettes. What I want to do is change all the colors at once, which is Global Adjust at the bottom. If I go to Global Adjust, I can go to the temperature slider, which allows me to adjust how warm or cool the three colors become. If I add less warmth, it becomes more blue, more warmth, it becomes more red. I want to go for that purple, but I do want it to look more warrior-esque, so a rich red like this might work. You can also adjust the saturation up here. I think the saturation is okay, so I'm going to leave it. You can adjust the brightness just below that. I'm going to make it just a little bit brighter, and luminosity is how much white is in it. I don't like to play with the luminosity too much because I find it downplays the saturation of the colors, and I find that that doesn't work so well on the screen. So I'm going to go back into my RGB panel. Once again, since we're working for digital media, we want to stay in RGB. You want to use CMYK for print and RGB for digital. And the reason that we're back in here is because the lightest purple that we have has changed into this low saturation pink color, which I don't like. So I'm going to manually adjust it to make it more rich and more vibrant, like so. Maybe a little too much, so we'll tone that down a bit. I liked that. Click Enter to save your changes. I forgot to select these purple shadows, so I'm going to adjust them manually in the Colors panel. They're a little too dark, so we're going to adjust them again by lowering the opacity. The last thing I want to show you for working with colors is multiple strokes and fill. We have talked about strokes and fill, about how you can apply strokes and fill to an object, but you can apply multiple strokes and fills to an object. I actually use this a lot when I'm drawing jewelry on a character. Gilgamesh actually has some bracelets here, but let's draw another one. So I'm using the stroke tool, shortcut \. I'm going to apply a gold color to it to make it colorful looking, and I want it to be a fairly thick bangle. So let's try stroke 15. Do you see where this does not line up right here at the edges? I didn't draw the bangle big enough, so to fix this, we can use the scale tool, shortcut S. We can click and drag holding Shift to make a perfect scale. And now I've got the bangle a little bit bigger than his arm, which makes much more sense than a little too small. So I've got the bangle, and let's say I want it to be a gold rim on the outside of the bangle and a darker bronzy color on the inside. What I could do is I have this gold stroke. I could duplicate it, copy and paste in place, and then make that second stroke darker and smaller, like a 10 point. Essentially, I could do that. That's 2 strokes, one on top of the other. That's kind of excessive. There's actually an easier way to do that. So I can select the original stroke that I have, and in the Appearance panel, if you can't find it, go to Windows and select Appearance. This will tell you exactly what strokes and fills and opacity are applied to your object. We have default opacity for all, so everything is at 100% opacity, and I have that gold stroke applied at 15 points. So if I want to add another stroke to that, with my stroke selected, I can either click Duplicate Selected Item, or I can click this button, which is just Add a New Stroke. So I've duplicated the stroke here, and now we know that we want a darker color, so with the right stroke selected, we're going to go into the Color panel and select a more bronzy, darker gold color. Then we can adjust the line to be thinner, like so. You have to make sure that the 10-point stroke bar is above the 15-point stroke bar, because like putting regular objects on top of each other in layers, the one on top will cover the one on the bottom. So if the 10 point was below the 15 point, the 15 point would cover the 10 point and you wouldn't see it at all. So make sure these strokes are layered appropriately and in the right order. You can play around with that to create lots of fun things. And when we talk about brushes later, you can really make this bangle fancy. And that concludes the section for character.